idea that it's about responsible gambling, it's about individuals who can't control themselves, quote unquote. This serves the industry's interest because what it does is it detracts from their products and practices, locating the blame for addiction and gambling-related harm in the individual alone.
What it creates is a real lack of understanding of the process of addiction. That what happens in the brain is a hijack of our natural survival mechanism. And what happens is there's a narrowing of focus of the attention to what the body deems is necessary for survival. So if you addict somebody, then the body says, you've got to do this to keep alive. Everything else in the world becomes grey. And there is no interest in anything else. That says that if you are addicted, even though there's a 50% chance that you will be, then you're not responsible. You're not a responsible person. You are morally defective.
I talked about its origins and how it's impacted on public policy in Britain. So its origins really are in the Reno Model, which was the sort of seen as the scientific basis for responsible gambling. And the Reno Model was devised by Alex Brzezinski, which was devised by Alex Brzezinski, who wanted to come up with a justification for an additional casino in Reno. And the whole theory behind it was, just to summarise it in very, very broad terms, was that it doesn't matter how many opportunities there are to gamble, there'll always be a certain proportion of people that get addicted to gambling, and therefore the problem is with them, those quote-unquote vulnerable individuals, not with the availability and accessibility of gambling and particular forms of gambling. So when this informed what is now known as the responsible gambling paradigm, and the outcome of that, or the consequences in terms of policy, were that governments would effectively provide the tools and resources for people to gamble, quote unquote, responsibly. They would provide education, information, signposting to support services, and give people the information they needed to make responsible gambling decisions. Now, as we know, this is simply not possible. People get addicted without choosing to get addicted. The products are addictive. There's lots that's wrong with that paradigm, with that worldview, but it has enabled the expansion of commercial gambling because policymakers can convince themselves that there's a scientific basis for increasing the opportunities to gamble without impacting on the rates of gambling-related harm. So in the UK, the way this manifested itself was through something called the Responsible Gambling Trust, and the gambling industry were required to provide voluntary contributions to the charity that had on its board gambling industry executives, and they would commission the research into what they call problem gambling. And by doing so, the gambling industry was able to control the research agenda. And this meant that when we were campaigning against fixed odds betting terminals for the stake to be reduced from £100 a spin down to £2, the Responsible Gambling Trust was in charge of commissioning research and controlling the research agenda around those machines. So what you end up happening was they had a lot of what we call industry-friendly academics who were commissioned by that charity to carry out this research. They've done a lot of work for the gambling industry. They're the equivalent really of the white coats that worked for the tobacco industry. And their entire approach to research is to research the individuals that get addicted rather than the products and what that induces or exacerbates in terms of the behaviour associated with those products. So what we ended up getting from the Responsible Gambling Trust was, instead of research that showed, which you might think intuitively is obvious, that machines on every high street at £100 a spin, offering roulette every 20 seconds, was obviously contributing to levels of gambling-related harm and eliciting losses beyond levels that were affordable. We had research that was about how we can determine which gamblers are addicted from the patterns of play in the data. It was a complete obfuscation, and this entire approach to research has been replicated across the world. And I think it's so important that in order to make the argument to policymakers is that is broken. That link is broken between the responsible gambling paradigm and independent research. One of the things that the gambling industry has been saying in the run-up to the white paper yesterday, and they're represented by an organisation called the Betting and Gaming Council, and their whole narrative and rhetoric is informed by this responsible gambling paradigm, where they say reform should be targeted at the minority who get addicted. Well, it's not an insignificant minority that are experiencing gambling-related harm. As we've spoken about several times today, it's the 5% driving the 86% of the revenues, and what their rhetoric implies is that's a static minority. It's not. It is a minority that, even if it is a minority, it's 5%, let's just say, it's always changing. It's always, the 95% are becoming the 5% over time. The more people are engaging with the product, and the more people are gambling, obviously, beyond the level that they otherwise perhaps would have. So this idea that it's about responsible gambling, it's about individuals who can't control themselves, quote unquote, this serves the industry's interest, because what it does is it detracts from their products and practices, and therefore the regulation and reform of those products and practices. It's locating the blame for addiction and gambling-related harm in the individual alone.
What's been the effect of that? And Matt has already touched on it, but the obfuscate, I would say, what we've known from all the addictive industries, the obfuscation of the link between the product and the health harm. In the end, that is the only aim. That they will do anything to stop that from being seen. And what happens when we speak? We say, we see you, we see what you are doing. And I think for all campaigns, that's for lived experience. I think we need to say that. We see what you are doing. We see that you are causing this harm, and we see that you are trying to obscure that. So these are just some of the really rather subtle things that are used in order to create that effect that Matt was talking about. So we need to balance the protection of the vulnerable with the continued enjoyment of the many who gamble responsibly. And actually, the Secretary of State used that language yesterday. So it hasn't ended, even though we've been campaigning against it for a long time. This idea of balance. So the idea of balance, that you're balancing equal things. And the idea, what it brings out very often is this idea of enjoyment. Again, this reinforcement of the idea it's a leisure activity that creates enjoyment, as opposed to the sale of an addictive product. That's the veil. It's a sale of an addictive product that lies behind a veil that says this is a leisure activity that creates addiction. So the idea that only 1% of adults are problem gamblers. Only 1%. That's an awful lot of people. And the idea, again, that this is a static number. In fact, there's this great churn. And we can see that in the problem gambling severity index, which is the diagnostic tool that diagnoses severity. And people move in and out of the what's called the problem gambler, but they are also then in the risk category. The idea most people gamble responsibly. What does that say? That says that if you are addicted, even though there's a 50% chance that you will be addicted, then you're not responsible. You're not a responsible person. You are morally defective. So what does this do? It undermines the international public health approach to the risks of gambling. There is a pretty good international approach to what should be a public health model. It creates the stigma and discrimination, which increases the suicide risk, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, and it deflects away from the role of the practices and products of design. So I think you could say those are the three effects of the responsible gambling model, and why we have to stop it. Why that is the key to all of the campaigning. So, individually, what happens? I've got here research from Australia, which matches the language of the industry to what gamblers think about themselves. And what are the common tropes? Gambling in moderation, the idea that you can be addicted to heroin in moderation. Personal responsibility for rational behaviour, the idea that addiction to that at that kind of level is that rationality is possible. Character flaws, that people think they have a character flaw. Jack said that to me, that had been said to him by a counsellor. You have to live with this. You've got an addictive personality. You will always have it. And personal responsibility to seek help. One of the civil servants said that to me in Charles, actually, when we went to see really early on, the Secretary of State. And she said, well, people just don't come forward for help. And that's repeated again and again and again in the literature. And the idea that more education is needed. So you can educate your way out of this. Again, in public health terms, the evidence is that that's just simply not possible. And we do need education and information, but actually regulation is the key, and you can't replace one with the other. So what does this do? As I said, there's the obfuscation of the link between the product and the health harm. But what it creates is a real lack of understanding of the process of addiction. When we've given evidence before Parliament, people don't understand how something that's not a substance can create this level of addiction. And because people don't understand it, they dismiss it. And that's really clear that that's how the politicians react. And when I speak to the NHS clinicians, then that helps me to understand it more clearly. And from partly my clinical background, although I didn't work with addictions at all, but then I speak to them and I hear what they're saying, and they're really clear that what happens in the brain is a hijack of our natural survival mechanisms, which we have grown better and better over evolution, and they've had to, because that's how we've survived as a species. And what happens is there's a narrowing of focus of the attention to what the body deems as necessary for survival. So if you addict somebody, then the body says, you've got to do this to keep alive. So everything else in the world, and There's so many of the recovering gamblers who've said this to me. Everything else in the world becomes grey. And there is no interest in anything else. And to be honest, I think quite often if a 20-year-old young man, if they lose interest in the opposite sex, or they lose interest in sex, I mean actually that's some achievement, isn't it? You know, it's a horrible thing to do to somebody. That you can't get any pleasure in life at all. You can't smell the flowers. And the effect on me, if I'm just speak personally for a minute, is whenever I take pleasure in something, I go out into the sun, turn my face to the sun, or smell a rose, I think, this is what Jack was robbed of.
Yes. 100%.
And then my last point is, what's the effect of this? Has been a deliberate obfuscation of the number of deaths. It's been very clear. Which has led to a complete lack of information and the public health model. But there's been a deliberate undermining of the evidence of the number of deaths. From when we first started, when I remember one of the people who were supporting us got literally shouted at in the corridors of Parliament. This can't be this many. This can't be this many. And the industry lobbyists continue to say that. And I mentioned this morning, didn't I, about a parliamentary question only this last week, which was trying to limit the powers of coroners to say that gambling has a significant cause. In fact, what's happened is that the leading suicide academic has actually started to say that, what's the word he uses for this apathy?
Dominant.
A dominant factor. But he has only in the last month said that gambling can be a dominant factor in the suicide, without which the suicide wouldn't have happened. That's a huge step forward. But we expect more pushback.
And it is that thing that she said, which is not only was Jack suffering the addiction and all of that was doing to him, but he was also being robbed of smelling the roses.
That's right.
And that's just appalling. So not only are you subject to the addiction, you have more misery piled on you. And it's so that in itself is just cruelty beyond. But the only other thing that I want to say is that as well, it leads to the wrong regulatory decisions. You come up with the wrong solutions because you're trying to introduce things which focus on individuals, faults with them, and that's your route forward. If I can just read that what we're talking about here is having a proper public health approach, and if I just read this, which acknowledges the risk and of harm, and includes, but is not limited to, recognising that gambling harms and gambling disorder do not arise from faulty individuals, but a complex interplay between products, industry practices, policy, lived environments, and the individual life circumstances and exposure. Identifying risks and taking action on all factors that increase and decrease risk, and sharing responsibility for action between legislators, regulators, operators, commissioners, providers of treatment and education, and individuals. So the responsible gambling model itself is a killer, and it leads us to the wrong solutions anyway. So I think that's probably all from us, and I guess we'll very happily take questions.
That'd be great. Who would like to ask the first question? John Cruz.
What was that last quote from, Charles?
That was, I can send it to you, John, but it's basically public health academics outlining what the public health approach is to gambling reform.
One question I have, and I'm not sure. One question that I'll ask you, and I'm not sure if you have data in the UK on this, but I was first introduced to this fact from Natasha Schull, who we'll hear from tomorrow, in her book Addiction by Design. Is she quoted a study where, because this is a fact that I've turned into a question that I'll ask anytime I'm at a public hearing or with individuals who, here we have these state problem gambling councils across the country or national problem gambling councils. And I always ask the question is, how much gambling industry profits come from citizens who practice so-called responsible gambling behavior? Because it's all they talk about. We're going to have responsible gambling month of March, and just like I put up that stat this morning with the alcohol. There's all these non-alcoholic companies that make beer and wine and so on, but there's no operator that identifies himself as a responsible gambling operator, right? You would think there'd be a niche for that. And so the stat that is in Natasha Schull's book that she quotes is that roughly 75% of the people, walking into a casino was 75% of the people coming into a casino practice so-called responsible gambling behavior, and they made up 4% of gambling revenues. Okay, 4% of gambling revenues. Okay, so you saw the stat from the UK from that Gambling Aware study that 86% of gambling profits were coming from 5% of the gamblers. All right. Well, the flip side of that is the so-called responsible gambler. All the people that just I just go and spend the money I came with, or I have set limits. So let's say they make up 75% of gamblers, 4% of gambling revenues. They're irrelevant to the business model. The business model is based on the irresponsible. Okay, making you irresponsible, making you out of control, preying on you. That's part of the con of this whole business is the responsible gambling. So yeah, I just wondered if there's a stat in the UK if you've ever talked about the profits. Because that's heard pro book's the only time I've seen that report.
But it's a matter of definition. Jack actually was met the definition of a responsible gambler.
Interesting.
And many of the young people who died of gambling their lives didn't spend very much, often free, met the definition of it. So what's defined as responsible gambling is still addicted.
Interesting. And
another take on that, and it is almost the reverse of the 86 from 5%, because that means that 95% are producing just 15. It's that Matt referred to that as a study this morning, which was called the Patterns of Play, and that was based upon the analysis of a year's data from 7 of the major online operators in the UK, and that is pretty much the only study that has actually really looked at where money comes from, the distribution of gambling money. Now that was for online, and probably online is more extreme in terms of the concentration of losses. But what you had in that was that very stark picture that actually, as far as the gambling industry is concerned, they probably only want that 5%. The other 95% will cost them to a certain extent. I saw on Twitter 2 or 3 weeks ago a gambling industry consultant, and he was showing figures from Spain. So this isn't going to be the complete answer for anybody, but it was the graph of showing what people win and what people lose. Now, there's this great big peak in the middle that most people lose, but they still only lose, a few hundred, a small number of hundreds of pounds a year. There's a small number of people who win a little bit. There's then these great tails, and you do have some people who do win big. Now, there might be questions as to whether how they're getting those wins and whether it's inside dealing, etc. But the alarming bit is that if you look at the tail at the other end, there is this significant proportion, 3, 4, 5% of people who are losing enormous amounts of money. Now, some of those may be incredibly wealthy people who are loving it and they're the whales and they can absolutely afford it, no worry at all. I suspect that's a vanishingly small number of people. So the reality is that the income is coming from that little tranche up there. And this industry consultant basically said, without them, the industry could not exist. That is who they rely on. It's a bit the question that you asked Matt this morning. Where is the responsible operator? Where is that model? I think in the UK, the only company I'm ever aware of was one called Tombola, which I think has now been taken over by Entain anyway.
Flutter, yeah.
Flutter. And that had the model of maximum stake of £2. Now, I don't know whether they made massive profits. They were certainly a profitable enough business to be bought by one of the big players. But that's a tiny, tiny proportion of the market. The mainstream market, the mainstream set of operators use the model where they're basing it on addiction. That doesn't answer your question perfectly, I hope, but it's that sort of thing.
Okay. But I will say that when you just mentioned that Flutter purchased, that the company Flutter purchased the only company that was the model £2 Fed. The first thing that came to mind is when Flutter's doing that is that anyone who understands this issue, or understands the issue, the biggest cost in the gambling industry, especially in the online gambling industry, is customer acquisition. So here if I'm Flutter, you have a finite amount of customers. Here you have an operator whose initial business model was the low rollers, so really the casual player. If they can buy that list, buy that company, and then if I can turn 10% of that list into hardcore out of control players by incentivizing and so on, now I get a huge return on that investment. So it's a great, you already have a list of people who've shown a likelihood of placing a bet to begin with. So, to me, initially that's what I thought of as a customer acquisition strategy for Flutter. Questions? John King.
Yes, I saw that one of the regulators was saying only 1% of people get addicted to gambling. And of course they're calling them problem gamblers or compulsive gamblers, which is not correct terminology. In the Illinois Law Review here, we've got more up-to-date numbers that say, wait a minute, we've got the academics here who say it's between 2 and 6% addicted, and between 6 and 18% problem gamblers on their way to becoming addicted. You're wrong. You haven't done your research. And one last quick thing. On the Red Book here, the 6 months after this came out, the gambling industry came out with their own Red Book in the same colors. Right. And I don't know what happened to it. I assume it's around somewhere, but it was obviously just to confuse people as to where the information was coming from. And on the suicides, we have, in the United States, Las Vegas has 4 times the suicide rate of the national average.
Wow.
Good number to remember.
Thank you.
I'd like to just recall a conversation I had with Matt Zarb-Cousin maybe a year or so ago, and he posed this question, or posed this observation to me, and it was one that I hadn't quite thought of it that way before, and it's something that I want to bring up now, let him articulate it, and as well as the Ritchies. Is so until we were identifying the problem we have, like in this country, that the gambling industry funds, the National Council on Problem Gambling, they fund the state councils. I have a colleague at Stop Predatory Gambling named Harry Levant, who's working really hard on trying to reform the so-called responsible gambling model that exists in the United States, as well as other people here are working to do that. But Harry's really taking a lead on it. But Matt, in conversation with Matt said to me, well, Les, what you're going to guys need to do is before you can dismantle it, you're going to need to have an alternative to people you can direct people to. Just like we saw, Ben Hires and Yo-Yo Yao talk about, they had an alternative, like some other community engagement efforts to pull people away from the casinos, to offer alternatives. Like, we need to have an alternative. So if we dismantle this infrastructure of so-called responsible gambling, what does it look like? So I'm just curious if you have some insights for us as we begin to think about, have that conversation. What do alternatives look like here in the U.S. and what should those conversations look like? So I don't know who would like to start, but.
It's very difficult, and I think it's probably more difficult for you because we have our National Health Service. which has in the last couple of years has started to really properly provide an alternative in terms of treatment.
Yes, I think I mentioned the Responsible Gambling Trust before, and that was industry controlled. And I think that the gambling industry will tend to fund organisations and programs that reinforce that responsible gambling paradigm and detract from their products and practices, whether that's through research or even treatment. You know, there used to be what was implied among treatment providers in Britain was that you couldn't really talk about the industry. They used to even censor some of the forums where people used to talk about their experiences if they were too critical of the industry. And this is it's really not good for people's recovery, first of all. I think that's the most important thing to say is, what I've found is people who are educated on why they've become addicted are much more likely, in my experience, this is anecdote, but my experience of the last few years, are much more likely to sustain their recoveries. It's pretty intuitive, really. If people know that they're engaged with an addictive product in a sector that has enabled them or facilitated them to do what they've done, to gamble beyond their means, and that was all by design, and it wasn't this aberration. They were kind of abusing the service that was being provided to everyone else in a kind of reasonable way. This is all part of the process. If people understand that helps in people's recovery. And what we've seen in the last few years in Britain is not just Gambling with Lives, there's other charities, GamFam, which is a sort of peer support, which everyone, it's open, it's an open forum, everyone talks about the industry and practices, and they're mobilised in a way that means that they want to take action in a positive way. GamLearn, which educates people who have come out of treatment and in recovery on what happens in the industry. This is why you got addicted. And yes, the National Health Service absolutely needs a much more integral role in delivery of treatment in Britain. It's just, I think that what I was saying to Les before, we've got education providers as well, which have been very much of the responsible gambling framing. So they were going to schools and they were trying to teach kids how to gamble responsibly. I mean, it's just not adequate whatsoever. It's actually, if anything, it's probably damaging. It's probably normalising gambling further. And what we should be getting is education on how the industry functions and operates.
I was just going to add that one of the ways that the industry has controlled it through the industry-funded charities is it's pervaded the whole system of referral into treatment. So there's been this attempt to undermine the Model Gambling Severity Index as an indicator of severity, and to not do proper triage of the, so that not to send the people who are really severely addicted, which actually is most people. The GTSI scores of people referring for treatment are in the upper 20s, but the threshold for definition is 8. And there's this attempt to hang on to people because there's an economic incentive for private organisations to hang on to people, even though they're not offering evidence-based treatment that actually also looks at products. And then to obscure the lack of evidence of effectiveness. At least if people go into the NHS, there's various forms of accountability to the state, and you get access to information, you get access to notes. This has actually directly affected, we know people who have died after inadequate treatment, failure to refer, and families have had real trouble. They've had to go to lawyers to get access to the notes from the industry-funded charities. It's quite deliberate.
And just a final word on this. I haven't got a great red volume to wave like John has, but here's a piece of paper which is an abstract from a research project, because real research is absolutely important and vital and underpins so much of what we talk about and say. And Liz saying about people only read the titles. Well, the title of this is The Politics and Fantasy of the Gambling Education Discourse, an analysis of gambling industry-funded youth education programs in the United Kingdom. I won't read it all, but it talks about the resources encourage young people to act as individuals, to control their impulses, and to correct what are portrayed as faulty cognitions with the aim of becoming responsible consumers. That's what those education programs are doing. And the conclusion, despite being delivered in the name of public health, the resources construct a discourse favourable to corporate interests. That's just how pervasive the responsible gambling model is. I'll stop on that.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Yes, Patrick.
Sure. You all touched on this in a previous panel, but I was just curious if you'd be able to elaborate, given your experience, on the influence of the gambling lobby, and then sort of a secondary question to that would be, do you perceive that there would ever be an opportunity for there to be political consequences electorally for those who are either literally or perceived to be carrying the water of the gambling lobby? Because of course that's one way I think to apply the sword in certain situations is to win electorally and make a statement thusly. So I know you've been in that environment extensively, so I'd love to have all your thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. The Times newspaper in London did an investigation recently where they posed as an investor in gambling companies and solicited members of Parliament for consultancy work, which is obviously not real, it was make-believe. The one such person who had been very vocal in support of the gambling industry in Parliament, almost reading off of the scripts of the lobby group, the Betting and Gaming Council, was very, very keen to meet this fake consultancy firm, and it was recorded in the process, agreeing to help them and saying all the fantastic things he could do to get advanced sight of the white paper, to influence certain things, how he would lobby ministers and all that sort of stuff. So they have their advocates in Parliament who are pretty unscrupulous, but we collectively have been able to expose all of that, and it doesn't land well with the public. Now, I think the thing to bear in mind is the public is on your side, much more on your side than the industry would have ever conceived. Poll after poll shows that there's public support for gambling reform, and for the government to go much further even than they have in the white paper in Britain. And they've tried to reconcile, to some extent, reforms that we've been pushing for with the industry's kind of pushback. But actually, the industry, who does it represent? It represents very few people. Its customers, the ones that are gambling all the time, are losing more than they can afford. So take advantage of that adversarial relationship that they have with their customers. They're not representative of them. They are opposed to them. They're opposed to their own customers. So this is the narrative they try to put forward is that they're trying to protect the interests and the right of people to have a bet. It's just a false narrative. Most people, 70, 80%, poll after poll, support the reforms that we've been pushing for. And for the affordability checks to take place at much lower levels than were announced yesterday. So I think getting some degree of some sort of picture of like where the public are on certain issues, on certain reforms that you're pushing for, and taking that to legislators and using that as evidence that they should be supporting this agenda, I think that's definitely the way forward.
We've all got elections coming up, haven't we? That's the answer, really. Just tell the public about the corruption. I don't think they like it. You asked about alternatives. I was just thinking about that, and Gambling with Lives has had to create its own alternatives. So bereaved families have got together and informed through the staff of Gambling with Lives, have created the education materials and now the information and training for health professionals.
Yeah. We need to do the same. We need to do our equivalent.
We can collaborate on it.
Exactly.
But you'll have to produce your own.
Yeah.
There is no other answer.
And I would just, as a former political operative, to Patrick's question, ultimately in this country, at some point in the next 5, hopefully not longer than that, but the next 5 years, when you have a prominent state legislator or a prominent member of Congress who will lose his or her seat because of their support for predatory gambling, then we've arrived. So I refer to that phrase as kind of like a political public hanging is what you need. Somebody who has been driving this issue, who's been carrying the water for the industry, but you need to show that you can lose a seat by carrying the water for this industry. And that day is coming. And that's something that, if anything I contribute, all the little, there's so many more people more talented than me in this business. I'm just kind of a small piece of this. But my role, hopefully, is at some point in the next 5 years, the way I can contribute the most is ultimately someone's going to lose a seat on this. And that starts putting the fear of God into people in public life. Those who carry the water for this industry, they know they're going to lose a seat on it. Then you got their attention. And that day is coming. And we're going to make, that day is inevitable. It's going to happen. So I didn't think, last question with Carrie Teal.
So can you tell us what the responsible gambling model, I understand it's a way for the industry to mitigate political damage, control research, but to what extent is it also used as a pro-gambling marketing message in itself? I saw an ad we're awash with gambling ads here right now, as you know, just doing sports betting. But I saw an ad a couple days ago that was really shocking, where they're saying, oh, I have a plan to win. And the plan is to use this like responsible gambling app. You can set limits for yourself. And I thought this, of all of the gambling ads I've seen, this was like the most bizarre. So.
I think that's a really good question, and I think it is quite subtle. The idea that you can win, that idea of most people gamble responsibly, or you can look at the ads, they appeal to young men. You can be a winner. You can be one of the gang. It's this false friendship. That kind of marketing. It seems to me that that's part of the whole narrative.
Yeah, I think it is also underrising the problem, the issue. So it's like saying, if you're a responsible person, then you will gamble responsibly, and there won't be an issue. It's the people that are irresponsible that need to be, learn how to control their gambling. They're the ones where the harm will take place. But actually, it's a proportion of people that gamble, and that can occur at any moment during their gambling behaviour, at any moment in their lives. It might be that the techniques that the gambling operators use and the products that they produce, that they offer to their users, become more and more sophisticated, and more people get addicted as a result of that. And that is an inherent contradiction. The operators will stand up and say, we're in favour of responsible gambling, look at all these programs that we fund, we want people to gamble responsibly, and at the same time they will be trying to get their users and their gamblers to be gambling more than they can afford and more frequently than they would otherwise have. And that is an inherent contradiction, and that is because the business model relies on
them. But you can see what you asked very clearly in the strapline when the fund stopped. And a lot of researchers have actually commented on the fact that the biggest word is fund. So that is marketing, which actually is supposed to be responsible gambling. Actually says it's
Just to add on that, there's been research done on those the phrases. It's not used now. It was replaced, but it was when the fund stopped, when the fund stopped. There was an academic study done on that, which actually showed that people who've seen that actually gambled more after they'd read that than those who hadn't. Not statistically significant, but it kind of shows it wasn't having an effect. And that was replaced by take time to think. That has also been tested. Lo and behold, whoa, had no impact at all. What there are in the UK is that there are a number of responsible gambling ads by each company, but actually everybody looks at these and thinks, what complete nonsense, because the solutions which are being, the people who will impose limits are probably people who actually are not going to need to impose limits. You know, so you're issuing sets of instructions or advice to people who don't need it. For those who do, they're ineffective. But what those responsible gambling ads are, they are just an advert for Sky Vegas, because that's how it ends, or Mr. Green. And you know, they even end, I think it was the Mr. Green advert, ended with the sort of gamble blah 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 at Mr. Green's. Yeah, they are adverts with a little bit of advertorial in front of them, or supposed sensible advice. So.
This question came online.
Okay.
The question is, I wonder if anyone has brought a wrongful death action for gambling-induced suicide.
Well, I can actually. Well, we'll take that. I mean, I only because we were involved with that. We tried to do that in a West Virginia federal court. Some amazing group of attorneys back in 2015, 2016 in this country brought a case from a woman who was a widow. Her husband was a major CFO of our big company in Western PA, and he killed himself because he was addicted to slot machines. And they had an incredible paper trail of all of his gambling losses. And it was in a West Virginia federal court. And so the West Virginia federal court said, before we can rule on this case, we need to find out what's legal in West Virginia. Like what duty of care, legal duty of care do the casinos have in West Virginia to its consumers? And in West Virginia, they have an elected Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, and it's a state, as you saw in Lucy's map, gets more than 10% of its public revenues, state revenues, come from gambling. So here you have an elected body, you have the most powerful special interest in the state, under fire here, and at the end of the day, what this West Virginia State Supreme Court ruled, sent back to the West Virginia Federal Court, was this: that essentially that the casinos in West Virginia have no legal duty of care to their customers, because the West Virginia legislature took all of that into account. You know, when they legalized this, that the benefits, quote unquote, economic benefits of this outweighed the harms, and so they voted unanimously. And there was a unanimous decision on that. And they sent it up to the federal court, and the federal court ended up just dismissing the case. So the short answer is there's not been a trial yet in this country of a so-called wrongful death suit. But that day is coming, and there's other strategies how to get there. But I just wanted to say that's something that is a big part of this movement, is to bring litigation. So it's a great question, but that's in the pipeline for sure. But that was a big setback, unfortunately. But it was at this time the timing in society wasn't right for that case. But in the near future, that's going to flip for sure. All right, with that, I'm going to end with this session here. If we can give our guests a round of applause for that session.